So let me very briefly present to you the status on climate change. Jayati sort of put it succinctly, and I think that's right. And if I was to condense this whole status presentation as well as the rest of the presentation, it's very simple. We are all in deep shit as far as the climate is concerned, and it's the responsibility of the global north to have put us there. And that's what the status is about, and that's what the negotiations at the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change is all about as well. And that's what I will be talking about in the next few slides. The status is fairly clear from a series of reports that have come out from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. There's been the 6th assessment report, 3 special reports, one on the cryosphere and oceans, one on land, and one on the target of limiting temperature rise to 1.5 degrees Celsius. This target has been moved up from the earlier target of limiting temperature rise to 2 degrees Celsius, with an ambition to try and achieve 1.5, but now it's more or less firmly set that we are aiming at 1.5. Although all scientists will tell you today, including the IPCC, that 1.5 degrees is no longer attainable. It's way past that. We are well set for much higher temperature rise. We've had COP26 at Glasgow, and we've had COP27 at Sharm el-Sheikh last year. All these reports, as well as reports on the eve of the COPs, tell us that we are looking at a possible temperature rise of about 2.4 Celsius. The slight silver lining in the cloud is that at the time of Glasgow, we may have been looking at 2.7 Celsius rise, which now it is estimated may only be 2.4 Celsius. We also know that the concentrations of greenhouse gases are dangerously high. They are already crossed 410 parts per million in the atmosphere. In particular, methane levels and levels of nitrous oxide, both of which have implications for agriculture, are at very dangerous levels, and we need to watch out for those. The other dangerous phenomena that has been noticed is that the absorptive capacity of sinks, that is forests and oceans, the higher the temperature rise, the lower the absorptive capacity. So we used to do calculations saying if this much goes up, this much will be absorbed, so we will even out. Now the amount that can be absorbed is going down the more the temperature rises. The other point that Jyoti touched upon is very clear from the reports. Arctic ice, glaciers, snows in the permafrost regions, on the Himalayas, etc., they're all melting at much more rapid rates than were thought earlier. Again, a small silver lining is that perhaps the Antarctic is melting slower than the Arctic, but recent findings show that under the ice in the Antarctic, the ocean is getting warmer. The Antarctic ice, which is very deep, may be melting from below, not from top. And consequences are completely unknown and unpredictable. And if that happens, as Jyoti said, God help us. With all the commitments made at Glasgow, and Glasgow was the level set after the Paris Agreement, saying all countries should raise their commitments to cut emissions by Glasgow, that was end of 22. It looks as if emissions will rise by about 10% by the year 2030 and maybe level off after that. whereas before Glasgow, we were looking at much higher temperature rises. However, the sixth assessment report tells us that global emissions should reach a maximum by 2025, and after that start declining to reach about 43% less than 2010 levels by 2030. We are extremely far away from that. We are nowhere near reaching those targets. Even with this temperature rise now, which is about 1.1 degrees Celsius, we are seeing over the last 2-3 years extreme impacts of climate change. We are seeing extreme heat waves, droughts, forest fires in North America, in Canada, where they've never had heat waves before. Last year, we saw parts of Canada reaching 50 degrees Celsius, which is temperatures that we see in Hisar or Vijayawada or places like that. In southern Europe, you've had heat waves, forest fires, which have destroyed half the forests in southern Europe, in places like Greece, etc. And we've seen extreme rainfall events, especially in the northern hemisphere, including in India, which has caused huge damage, huge economic losses, and for the first time, a large number of deaths in European countries. This has come as a shock to the global north, particularly in Europe, who always thought of climate impacts as something befalling the least developed countries, the island nations in Melanesia, and so on, but not hitting Europe. And now they are seeing the impacts in Europe as well. Part of it, the scientific reasons I will not go into here, but the more changes we see in climate, the more the prospects are for such extreme events. You've seen huge floods in Europe, and of course we've seen it in our neighborhood in Pakistan earlier. In India, we have seen urban flooding as a recurring phenomena. And if you actually look at the economic losses that have been suffered because of urban flooding, they are huge, incalculable right now, but we are carrying on as if this is business as usual, and it is something that's going to happen every year. Landslides are becoming more frequent. We have seen those in Uttarakhand, in Himachal, elsewhere in our country, which are exacerbated. Poor planning, excess urbanization, multiplied by climate impacts, are seeing all this happen. Greater frequency and severity of tropical cyclones, more coastal erosion, etc. What is now being spoken about by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Changes may be temperature rise will stop if we reach this new target which has been set of net zero emissions by 2050, but this is not actually true. It will only stop rising if the total emissions, what's called the carbon budget, is within the prescribed limit by 2050. So it doesn't matter, you can achieve net zero, but by that time, if you have already emitted more than what the carbon budget is, then it doesn't matter whether you're at net zero or not. Temperatures will keep rising. And worse, even if temperature rise stops, other impacts like sea level rise, changes in rainfall patterns, extreme weather events will continue even after that. In terms of the multilateral process and what's been happening in the negotiations, there's total failure at COP26 in Glasgow to raise ambitions to reach the targets. That never happened in Glasgow. COP27, Sharm el-Sheikh was even worse, if that's possible. And most of this is because of the developed countries. The US, EU, Japan, etc. The US raised its targets to some extent from the earlier targets, but that is still about 30% lower than the target set by the European Union. And that's horrible, given the high levels of emissions from the US. And the EU, which was long believed to be the green champion in climate change, has only set a target of reducing emissions by 55% against what the scientists have recommended should be between 80 to 90% reduction below 1990 levels. I've spoken to you already about the misleading target of net zero. Let me briefly mention that there's two other important aspects about this net zero target. The way it has been propagandized is all countries should reach net zero. So there's no differentiation between developed and developing countries, and it pursues what's called the forward-looking perspective set for the UN negotiations by the United States, which essentially means ignore the historical emissions, just think of where you are going forwards. Whereas we know that climate change is caused because historically the industrialized countries have caused about 77% of the accumulated greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. All this while, cynically, the US, the EU, the UK have actually increased coal-fired power plants, citing the Ukraine war, and increased their use of natural gas as what they call a transitional fuel. That is a transition from fossil fuels to green fuels like solar, etc. Those who know will tell you that the difference between the emissions caused by natural gas and caused by petroleum is hardly anything to speak about. At the same time, they are campaigning against Nigeria and other African countries switching to natural gas, saying, don't do this, it's very bad for you. Campaigning against India and China for using coal as a transitional fuel to solar. And finally, of course, the $100 billion commitment for financing to developing countries is nowhere in sight. Glasgow put it off to 2023, even though they made noises about increasing a fund for adaptation. I'll flag a few issues of concern here. At COP27, why I described it as going worse is that there were a lot of backroom maneuvering by the oil-producing countries of the Middle East, led by the COP president in Egypt. And you've now got language in the text which does not talk about renewable energy, but talks about low-emission energy sources, which is code for switching to natural gas rather than solar or wind. There was a lot of talk hailing the achievement in Sharm el-Sheikh that finally loss and damage has now become part of the UN Framework Convention. I have never been convinced about this, partly because the US and others have made absolutely sure that loss and damage is not considered as compensation, reparation, anything of that kind, but a kind of charitable contribution by the US, etc., to the developing countries. And worse, that the more you talk about the money, the less you talk about mitigation and what needs to happen on that front. And the loss and damage, even though the numbers spoken of were huge, the Sharm el-Sheikh declaration speaks about something like an estimated $5.8 trillion has been estimated. We have not even seen a fraction of the $100 billion that, so you can put all kinds of numbers that you want and build castles in the sky, but we are not going to see any of that.
Commitments are 2 billion.
Sorry?
Commitments are 2 billion.
Commitments are 2 billion. 100 billion is what is there on paper. So you can put any number that you want on the table. It's going to be of no use, because the money that the developed countries are going to put on the table, including through loans and multilateral agencies, etc., is all coming out of the same pocket. You can give it different names: adaptation fund, mitigation fund, loss and damage. It's the same amount of money that's going to come from them anyway, and none of that is coming anymore. Quickly about India. At COP26 at Glasgow, it was amazing that there were extremely mixed signals coming from India. Prime Minister himself had gone there. he said one thing. The officials representing India were saying something completely different. And everyone was left wondering what's going to happen. Finally, India's formal submission, the nationally determined contributions came out, did not contain Prime Minister Modi's main commitment, which was to reach net zero emissions by 2070. But in India, that's continually spoken about. Net zero by 2070, although it's no part of any official document or policy level commitment made anywhere in writing. We have a rather large target of 500 gigawatts of renewable energy, most of which is supposed to be solar. We are very far away from that. All kinds of constraints are being faced in terms of investments, in terms of land, where you will put this solar. So it's doubtful we are going to reach that target. And the other major target linked to renewables is the more you increase solar power, the more you face a huge technical challenge, which is because of fluctuations in solar power, you can't just install solar power. Along with that, you need to install storage systems. How do you store solar power? 500 gigawatts you can't store in batteries. You'll have to occupy the whole of India if you want to store 500. So the only way to store that is to pump water up like you do for a dam. You store it in the dam and then you let it out when you want, generate the power. That's called pumped storage. Where do you go for this pumped storage? The existing dams which you have is the only place. You can't construct new dams because you have all the problems which we know are associated with large dams. You run into those problems. So the more solar you have, the more you're confronted with this problem of pumped storage, and that's going to be a major constraint which we are not talking about. And finally, in terms of India, the NDCs that we have committed confine themselves largely to electricity generation. And that's a major concern for me. We all know that if you want to transition to a low carbon economy, and like Abhijit said, we all know we have to. If we are to transition to a low carbon economy, and especially an equitable low carbon economy, which means that those who don't have access to energy or who have less access to energy will have that access. You need to tackle many other sectors so that we even out the current unevenness and inequality in energy consumption and energy use. We have not touched any of those aspects in India's NDC, and we are facing huge impacts. I've spoken about extreme rainfall events, urban flooding, agriculture, which we are facing, but we have not even started talking about what is required for adaptation or making assessments. At COP27 in Sharm el-Sheikh, a new 4-year process has been initiated called Food and Agriculture for Sustainable Transformation. Now, this 4-year process follows up from an earlier 4-year process called the Coronivia Joint Work on Agriculture, which actually started way back in COP23. That's 4 COPs back. And this has, what's important, I think, to understand is we are already talking about something that's been going on for 8 years and which has really nothing to show. We are still at a discussion stage, framing of questions, framing of issues and methodologies. We haven't yet got down to any specifics in terms of actions, even though the program talks about scaling up funding for actions on agriculture. But we still don't know what these actions are going to be, what's going to happen, etc. If you read the text, what clearly emerges is that there are numerous contradictions between different interest groups in this, as may well be imagined. There are agro-business groups involved, there are corporates involved, there are energy companies involved, etc. But there's another contradiction, if you like, which is involved. The aim of this process is to address both mitigation related to agriculture, that's reducing emissions, as well as adaptations in relation to agriculture. How do you adapt to climate change? The executive director of UN Climate Change has said that 1.5 Celsius, the target of limiting temperature rise to 1.5 degrees, is not possible without cutting emissions from food systems, which he says accounts for about 30%. There's some debate about these numbers, fungible numbers, but which he says is about 30% of total global emissions. That's a lot. So he says 1.5 C is not possible unless you address emissions from agriculture, and that includes animal husbandry. At the same time, agriculture and food systems are themselves at risk from climate impacts. So you are juggling with two things which appear to be contradictory, but which in fact, if you think of solutions, and the documents from Sharm el-Sheikh quote some experts, people who have been on the panel of IPCC, etc., who talk about transforming agricultural systems in such a way that you can address both the issues of emissions from agriculture as well as build climate resilience from agriculture, such as through agroecological systems, addressing hydrological imbalance, addressing nitrogen balance issues, because one of the major challenges is the amount of nitrogen that goes into the agricultural system, which then result in nitrous oxide emissions, which is a very powerful greenhouse gas, etc. The focal points which have been emphasized are to assess adaptation, resilience, and co-benefits. Co-benefits means also systems of agriculture which address both reducing emissions as well as addressing adaptations. For example, through reducing nitrogen, by increasing hydrological balance, etc. Second is by improving health, carbon, and fertility, soil, in relation to soil. That is, by addressing soil health, soil carbon, and soil fertility, all three together, including water management. The third is to improve the nutrient use and manure management, which of course assumes importance in terms of the methane emissions. Improved livestock management, which doesn't need explanation, and to address not just technical issues related to agriculture, but socio-economic and food security dimension. Now, these are very broad principles. And that's the point I really wanted to make, is that the discussions on ag in the climate negotiations are really not even off the ground floor yet. But 2 points I thought I would mention specifically. Indian government has taken a position in the climate negotiations as well as elsewhere. Don't touch agriculture. They don't want any international discussions which will impinge upon what India can do internally with regard to agriculture or agricultural policy. I was fortunately or unfortunately a member of the then Planning Commission's Low Carbon Committee, which was formed after the Copenhagen targets. And we were discussing in that committee various sectoral options of how to reach the Copenhagen targets, which was of reducing emissions intensity by 20 to 25%. And there we were categorically told by the Planning Commission and by the ministry, don't touch agriculture. Just forget it, don't even talk about agriculture, it's off the agenda. So I feel that India will resist any imposition of norms, rules, standards in agriculture, and I think that will spread across not just the climate negotiations but into other fora as well. That's one part. Second part is, while these discussions take place, I think it is important for all of us and social movements in general to look at the issue of agriculture carefully. Because there is no doubt that there are going to be impacts on agriculture due to climate change. There are already recorded impacts of fairly serious dimension. And it is also true that there are variety of interventions that we can make in agriculture which would have a salutary effect on both emissions as well as on adaptation to agriculture. The big regret is that in India we had something called the National Mission on Sustainable Agriculture, which again is not taken off at all. While solar mission, other missions have taken off, NMSA, Mission on Sustainable Agriculture, has just not taken off at all. Many civil society movements, social movements are there which are looking at such options, but I feel these are yet to achieve any kind of a critical mass and require further discussion amongst us as to what it is. Because there are also several people who would comment along the lines of what I said, the government's position, don't touch agriculture, to say that, look, if you start playing around with this, you will impinge upon food security or food productivity, and therefore be careful. And our discussions need to account for those also. Thank you.